Welcome to this explainer. Now, if you're tackling advanced historical studies, especially at the IBDP level, you already know that history is never just some simple, boring list of dates. It's a giant, complicated puzzle of missing pieces, shifting perspectives, and evolving interpretations. Today, we're deconstructing Norse society in the dawn of the Viking Age. And because we're taking a strict historiographical approach today, you'll notice we aren't relying on romanticized pictures or pop culture images. Instead, we are diving straight into the raw texts, the hard data, and the conflicting evidence to see how this history is actually constructed.
Here's our roadmap for today's deep dive. We'll be moving through environment and survival, power, thralls, and reciprocity, gender roles and status, polytheism and belief, and we'll wrap up by evaluating the historical perspectives around Lindisfarne.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, Environment and Survival.
To really understand the Norse, you have to start with the harsh, freezing geography of Scandinavia. It was an environment that made maritime travel an absolute prerequisite for survival. Now, to frame this era of expansion, let's anchor the Viking Age chronologically. While Norse culture existed long before this, historians generally box in this era of intense raiding from the late 8th century, starting with the 789 Wessex raid and the infamous 793 Lindisfarne attack, all the way up to the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066.
But when we look at how they actually lived day to day, we immediately hit a massive historiographical roadblock. The Norse built their multifunctional longhouses using a technique called wattle and daub. Because materials like wood, clay, turf, and dung are highly perishable, they literally just rot away over the centuries. So what does that mean for us? Well, it means modern archaeologists usually only find post holes and mere foundations. We are left with this incredibly incomplete physical evidence of their domestic lives, which forces us to rely much more heavily on other types of sources.
Moving on to Section 2, Power, Thralls, and Reciprocity.
Norse society was deeply, rigidly stratified. And at the very bottom of this hierarchy were the thralls. Thralls were enslaved individuals who essentially served as the economic backbone of the entire society, doing the absolute most demanding agricultural and domestic labor. As Norse trade and maritime networks expanded, the capture and trade of thralls became a massive, calculated motivator for their overseas raiding. You see, it wasn't just about stealing gold and silver. It was fundamentally about acquiring human capital.
We can actually see this stark, brutal social division reflected directly in the literature. Listen to this extract from the Saga of the Volsungs, where a thrall named Hjalli is explicitly described as a cowardly pig keeper whose heart quakes tremulously. The author deliberately contrasts him with the valiant, stoic nobleman. This is a perfect example of how our literary sources were crafted with a specific agenda: to elevate elite warrior values by actively dehumanizing thralls and treating them as nothing more than disposable property.
So, how did those elites actually hold on to their power? Interestingly enough, early Norse authority wasn't strictly hereditary. You didn't just get to be chief because your dad was. Chiefs maintained their status through reciprocity, which was this incredibly careful, calculated system of gift exchange. You provided wealth, feasts, and protection, and in return you received loyalty and political authority. Plus, disputes weren't just settled by some king making a decree, they were managed collectively by free men at assemblies known as things. It was a really delicate, constant balancing act of generosity and mutual obligation.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, Gender Roles and Status.
Here's a great inquiry question to chew on. What actually was the role and status of Norse women? For decades, textbooks gave us a very rigid, binary answer. But as advanced students of history, you know that when new scientific methods emerge, we are often forced to completely rethink our assumptions and synthesize conflicting evidence.
Case in point. The orthodox archaeological perspective used to rely completely on grave goods. The logic was simple. Weapons in a grave meant a man, and spindles meant a woman. But then, in 2017, we got a literal game changer. DNA analysis of a very famous high-status warrior grave in Birka, Sweden, a grave packed to the brim with weapons, was definitively proven to belong to a female. This cold, hard biological data absolutely shattered the long-held assumption that only men occupied martial roles in Norse society.
And when we take that data and synthesize it with the written sources, a much more complex picture emerges. The Grágás laws explicitly outline female rights to inheritance and managing household finances. The Landnáma book, the Book of Settlements, highlights independent women like Thora who owned massive amounts of land and managed immense hospitality. And the sagas? They frequently depict women as vital advisors and estate managers.
So, the takeaway here is that while it absolutely was a patriarchal society, Norse women clearly held significant economic and domestic power within their kin groups.
Moving into Section 4, Polytheism and Belief. The Norse followed a rich, polytheistic system, worshipping deities like Odin, Thor, and Freya, all connected by the great world tree Yggdrasil. But this is where you really need to apply your source evaluation skills. The extreme limitation we face is that the Norse did not leave behind contemporary written records of their own faith. We rely incredibly heavily on the poetic and prose Eddas. But here's the catch. These texts were compiled in Iceland in the 13th century. That is long after Christianity had completely taken over. So the origin and purpose of these texts deeply color their reliability. We are essentially viewing Norse paganism filtered entirely through a later Christian lens.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 5, Lindisfarne, Evaluating Historical Perspectives. On June 8, 793 CE, Norse raiders struck the sacred monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of England. The Northumbrian scholar Alcuin of York wrote about this in absolute horror, stating, "A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as prey to pagan peoples." Historiographically, this single event is massive. It wasn't just the physical destruction of a monastery, it was the moment the Scandinavian world violently and shockingly smashed its way into the consciousness of Christian Europe.
The contemporary account from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle goes even further. It describes dreadful forewarnings and fiery dragons flying in the air, and states that the harrowing inroads of heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God by rapine and slaughter. You can literally hear the terror in the text. The language is incredibly emotive, highly subjective, and utterly steeped in religious trauma.
But that leads us to a really vital analytical question. If we force ourselves to look past the dramatic, traumatic accounts of these primary sources, to what extent did economic motives actually prompt Norse exploration? Were they truly sent by divine wrath to punish Christians, or was there something far more structural going on beneath the surface?
Let's juxtapose these two prevailing perspectives. On one hand, modern archaeology focuses heavily on material motives. To a Norse raider, a monastery was essentially an undefended bank, filled with wealth and people who could be captured and sold as thralls, driven perhaps by harsh Scandinavian population pressures. On the other hand, the Christian chronicles interpret the exact same raids through a strictly religious paradigm, seeing it only as divine punishment and senseless heathen savagery.
So, when we run a quick OPVL analysis on something like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the limitations become glaringly obvious. Yes, its value is high for giving us specific contemporary dates and the exact targets of these raids, but its origin, written by Christian monks, and its purpose, recording history through a strict moral framework, means it is highly subjective. It completely ignores the underlying economic drivers and complex social needs of the Norse, attributing the raids purely to religious devastation. Taking these monastic sources at face value gives us a deeply skewed, one-sided version of history.
To summarize our explainer today, the Viking Age didn't just happen in a vacuum, and it certainly wasn't born out of random, mindless savagery. It was driven by very complex environmental constraints that forced a society to the sea, a deeply stratified social hierarchy that required the constant acquisition of wealth and thralls, and an intricate political system heavily based on reciprocity. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder. As historians, when we are trying to piece together the reality of the past, whose truth actually holds more weight? Is it the visceral, subjective trauma recorded by the victims in the chronicles, or is it the cold, hard, objective data unearthed by the modern archaeologist? It is the ultimate historiographical balancing act, and mastering it is exactly what makes studying history so profoundly fascinating. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the sources.